I never thought my own son would look through me like a stranger at my husband's funeral. Snow drifted quietly outside the chapel windows while guests filled the front pews beneath soft organ music and the scent of white lilies. And for a moment, I stood frozen near the entrance, clutching my black gloves, because Ethan never once turned around to look for me. My husband of 44 years rested only 20 feet away inside a polished mahogany casket, yet somehow I felt farther from him than anyone else in that room. Vanessa adjusted the sleeve of her designer black coat before leaning toward Ethan and whispering something that made him glance briefly in my direction, then immediately look away again. "Family seating is full," she said softly when I approached the front row, her smile polished enough to fool anyone who did not hear the coldness underneath it. I nodded slowly, even though 3 empty chairs sat near the aisle untouched. That hurt more than I expected. The pastor began speaking about loyalty, devotion, and family legacy, while I stood alone beside the back wall listening to strangers praise the man I built a life with long before Harper Industries became successful enough for people to admire publicly. Near the altar, attorney Robert Hale quietly watched me from across the chapel, holding a thin leather portfolio tightly against his chest, and unlike everyone else's expression carried something deeper than sympathy. It looked almost like concern. During the final prayer, Ethan stepped forward beside the casket, speaking confidently about continuing his father's vision for the future, and several executives nodded respectfully, while Vanessa squeezed his hand proudly. Nobody mentioned the years Richard and I spent terrified of losing our home while trying to keep the company alive. Nobody mentioned who stayed awake balancing payroll when investors walked away. Then Ethan glanced toward me briefly and said something that made the room suddenly feel 10 degrees colder. "Dad prepared everything before he passed," he announced calmly. "There will not be any confusion moving forward." I lowered my eyes toward the leather purse resting against my side, where the only sign will still remained hidden inside, and for the first time that morning I wondered what my son's face would look like once he realized the future he already claimed did not legally belong to him at all. The funeral reception moved into the private dining hall beside the chapel, where crystal chandeliers reflected softly across polished marble floors, and servers carried silver trays of coffee and champagne through clusters of wealthy guests already whispering about the future of Harper Industries before my husband had even been buried. I stood near the back wall holding a paper cup of untouched coffee while Ethan laughed quietly with several executives beside the fireplace, and every time someone offered condolences he accepted them like the company already belonged entirely to him. "Richard built something extraordinary," one investor told him. "You are ready to lead now." Ethan nodded confidently. "Dad prepared me for this years ago." Hearing that almost made me speak, but I stayed silent. Vanessa approached me a few minutes later wearing the same practiced smile she used inside the chapel. "You should try to rest after today," she said softly. "The legal process can become overwhelming at your age." I stared at her for a second longer than she expected. "Richard and I handled difficult things together for decades," I replied calmly. Her expression tightened immediately. Across the room, attorney Robert Hale continued watching every conversation carefully while keeping the leather portfolio close beside him like he was guarding something valuable. Then Ethan walked toward me holding a glass of bourbon in one hand. "Mom," he said quietly, lowering his voice. "Tomorrow morning Robert will review Dad's estate documents with the family. I just need you to cooperate so things move smoothly." Cooperate. The word hit harder than any insult Vanessa delivered all afternoon. I looked directly into my son's eyes and suddenly realized he truly believed I was no longer part of the future being planned around me. Before I could answer, Robert stepped beside us, unexpectedly, and spoke in a calm, steady voice that immediately changed the air between us. "Actually," he said while glancing toward Ethan, "there is one very important document your mother still has not shown anyone yet." The entire reception hall seemed to freeze after Robert's words because conversation stopped almost instantly, and several executives near the fireplace slowly turned toward us with visible curiosity. Ethan frowned. "What document?" he asked sharply. Robert adjusted his glasses calmly. "The only signed copy of Richard Lawson's final will." Vanessa blinked twice before looking directly at me for the first time all evening, like she was suddenly seeing someone completely different standing in front of her. "That is impossible," she said quietly. "The attorney office handles those documents." Robert shook his head once. "Not this one." I could feel the tension spreading across the room while snow tapped softly against the tall dining hall windows. Ethan stepped closer toward me, lowering his voice. "Mom, if Dad left paperwork with you, then why have you not said anything?" The question almost made me laugh because for the entire funeral my own son treated me like I barely belonged beside his father's coffin, yet now suddenly everyone wanted answers from me. "You never asked," I replied calmly. His jaw tightened immediately. Around us, several relatives pretended not to listen while clearly hearing every word. Vanessa folded her arms. "This does not change anything," she said carefully. "Ethan is still Richard's successor." Robert looked directly at her. "That depends entirely on what the signed will says." Silence crashed across the room again. I slowly reached for my purse, feeling the folded document resting inside beneath my gloves and car keys. My hands trembled slightly, not from fear but from grief, because Richard trusted me with this before he died, knowing exactly what would happen after he was gone. Then Ethan suddenly stared at Robert with growing panic. "Wait," he whispered. "You mean nobody else has seen the signed version yet?" Robert answered with 4 quiet words that changed everything. "Not until tomorrow morning." By the time the reception finally ended, the atmosphere inside the dining hall felt completely different from the polished confidence Ethan carried earlier that afternoon. People still spoke quietly in small groups beneath the chandeliers, but now every conversation stopped the moment I walked past them, holding my purse close against my side. They all knew the signed will was somewhere inside it. Ethan followed me into the empty hallway outside the chapel, while Vanessa remained several steps behind him, with visible frustration written across her face. "Mom, we need to talk privately," Ethan said quickly. His voice sounded different now. Softer. Careful. I turned slowly toward him beneath the dim wall lights, and for a moment I barely recognized the man standing in front of me, because grief and fear had finally replaced the confidence he wore all day. "You already decided I was not part of this family anymore," I answered calmly. "Now suddenly you want privacy?" He lowered his eyes immediately. That silence told me more than words could. Vanessa stepped forward, crossing her arms tightly. "Nobody is attacking you," she insisted. "We are only trying to keep things organized." I watched her carefully without responding, because people reveal themselves most clearly when they think control is slipping away. Outside the tall chapel windows, snow covered the parking lot in thick white layers, while funeral guests slowly drove away through the dark evening. Robert appeared at the far end of the hallway, carrying the leather portfolio against his chest. "Tomorrow. 9 o'clock sharp," he announced calmly. Conference room at Harper Industries. Ethan nodded immediately. Fine. Then Robert looked directly at me before adding one sentence that changed the entire emotional balance again. Mrs. Lawson, please remember to bring both signed copies with you. Ethan's face lost all color. He stared at me in complete confusion. Both copies, he whispered. And for the first time since Richard died, I realized my son truly had no idea how much his father trusted me before the end. The next morning, snow covered downtown Boston, while executives, lawyers, and family members filled the top-floor conference room at Harper Industries, expecting a routine estate meeting that would officially place Ethan Lawson in control of the company his father spent 40 years building. I arrived quietly wearing the same modest black coat from the funeral, while conversation stopped almost immediately around the polished glass table. Ethan barely looked at me as Robert Hale organized legal folders near the head of the room. Let us begin, Robert said calmly before removing 2 sealed envelopes from his leather portfolio. Vanessa leaned toward Ethan, whispering something confident into his ear, but neither of them noticed the way several senior executives kept watching me instead of the documents. Robert slowly opened the first signed will and began reading Richard Lawson's final instructions regarding family assets, company ownership, and estate distribution. Ethan listened with growing impatience until Robert reached one specific paragraph. Then everything changed. Under the final signed agreement, Robert announced clearly, all controlling shares of Harper Industries remain exclusively under Margaret Lawson's authority unless she personally transfers ownership. Ethan stared at him in complete disbelief. That is impossible, he snapped. Dad owns 60% of this company. Robert nodded once. Incorrect. Your mother has quietly held 51% for the last 18 years. The entire room fell silent. Even Vanessa looked stunned. I watched my son's face slowly collapse as realization finally reached him, because suddenly every conversation from the funeral, every assumption, every confident promise about his future disappeared in front of him all at once. Robert continued reading calmly. Richard Lawson transferred majority ownership to Margaret during the financial crisis of 2006 after she personally saved the company from bankruptcy using inherited family assets nobody outside this room ever knew existed. My hands rested quietly in my lap while executives exchanged shocked looks across the table because the woman treated like a burden at the funeral had secretly controlled the company longer than anyone there realized. Then Robert opened the second signed envelope and spoke 7 words that hit even harder. Margaret Lawson is also sole executor permanently. The conference room exploded into whispers the second Robert finished reading the final line of the will, and for the first time since Richard died, Ethan looked completely unprepared for the reality standing in front of him. No, he said sharply while pushing his chair backward across the polished floor. There has to be another agreement. Robert remained calm. There is not. Vanessa grabbed the edge of the table, trying to keep her composure, while several executives exchanged stunned glances beside the windows overlooking the snowy Boston skyline. Ethan turned toward me with anger rising through his voice. You hid this from me for 18 years. I held his stare quietly. Your father asked me to protect the company. That answer only made him more frustrated. Protect it from who? He snapped. The room went silent again because everyone already knew the answer. Robert opened another file and slid several financial records across the table. During the 2006 crisis, he explained, Mrs. Lawson personally invested $32 million inherited from her family trust to prevent Harper Industries from collapsing. Vanessa stared at me in shock. Your family had that kind of money? I nodded once. Long before I met Richard. Ethan slowly sat back down, looking almost sick as memories clearly replayed inside his head, because suddenly the modest house, the old coat, and the quiet life I lived no longer matched the woman described in those documents. Then Robert delivered another blow. There is one final condition attached to the estate. Every executive looked up immediately. Mrs. Lawson must personally approve the next chief executive officer of Harper Industries. Ethan's face hardened again. Dad wanted me to run this company. Robert closed the folder carefully. Perhaps, he answered. But legally your mother makes the final decision now. I watched my son carefully across the table while snow drifted against the tall glass windows, because for the first time in his life, Ethan Lawson was being forced to ask himself one terrifying question. Had he already destroyed his only chance to inherit the future he thought belonged to him? The tension inside the conference room became almost unbearable after Robert finished speaking, because nobody moved, nobody reached for coffee, and nobody even looked away from Ethan as he sat frozen beside the floor-to-ceiling windows, with snow falling heavily behind him. Then suddenly he stood up so fast his chair slammed backward against the marble wall. This is insane, he snapped while staring directly at me. You let me spend my entire life believing Dad built this company. I remained calm. He did build it, I answered quietly. But he did not build it alone. Vanessa stepped between us, trying to control the situation before the executives watching nearby became even more uncomfortable. Margaret, she said carefully, nobody is denying your sacrifices. I looked at her steadily. You denied them the moment you treated me like I did not belong at Richard's funeral. Silence crashed across the room again. Ethan rubbed both hands across his face before speaking in a lower voice, filled with frustration. Then why did you hide all of this from me? That question hurt more than his anger, because deep down I realized my son still did not understand the difference between privacy and invisibility. Your father protected me from people who only respected money, I replied softly. Yesterday proved he was right. Several executives lowered their eyes immediately. Robert quietly closed another legal folder before speaking again. There is still one unresolved matter concerning the future leadership of Harper Industries. Ethan looked up quickly. Hope flashed across his face for the first time all morning. I have worked at this company for 15 years, he argued. Dad trained me himself. Robert nodded once toward me. Which is why Mrs. Lawson now has to decide whether you are emotionally capable of leading it. Ethan turned toward me completely stunned. The entire room waited silently while I slowly stood from my chair holding the signed will in my hands. And for the first time since Richard died, I realized my next words would determine not only the future of the company, but the future of my relationship with my own son forever. The room remained completely silent after I stood holding the signed will, because everyone understood the future of Harper Industries no longer depended on financial projections, board recommendations, or family expectations. It depended entirely on me. Ethan slowly stepped closer toward the conference table, while the confidence he carried at the funeral disappeared almost completely from his face. Mom, he said quietly, I made mistakes yesterday. Vanessa immediately looked at him in shock, because it was the first time all morning he stopped speaking like a future chief executive officer and started sounding like someone afraid of losing everything. I watched both of them carefully before answering. You did not just make mistakes yesterday, I replied softly. You stopped seeing me years ago. Those words hit harder than any legal document Robert had read aloud, because Ethan lowered his eyes, instantly unable to argue with the truth sitting directly in front of him. Around the room, several executives pretended to study paperwork while clearly listening to every sentence. Vanessa crossed her arms tightly, trying to regain control. "This is emotional right now," she insisted. Richard would not want the company affected by personal feelings. Robert looked directly at her. "Mrs. Lawson legally protected this company long before most current executives even worked here." Vanessa said nothing after that. The collapse in her expression told me she finally understood the power she spent years dismissing. Then Ethan surprised everyone by speaking again in a voice barely above a whisper. "I thought Dad trusted me more than anyone." My chest tightened hearing that, because beneath the arrogance, frustration, and entitlement, I could still hear the little boy who once waited near the front window every night for his father to come home from work. I slowly placed the signed will onto the conference table. "Your father trusted both of us," I said quietly. "The difference is that he never forgot who stayed beside him before success arrived." Ethan stared down at the document in silence while snow continued falling outside the glass windows, and for the first time since Richard died, I realized my son was finally beginning to understand exactly what his father had tried to protect all along. Later that afternoon, most of the executives quietly left the conference room, while snow continued falling across the Boston skyline outside the tall glass windows, and for the first time since Richard's funeral began, the building finally felt calm again. Ethan remained seated near the end of the long conference table, staring silently at the signed will resting beside his hands, while Vanessa stood near the doorway, no longer speaking with the confidence she carried only 24 hours earlier. Robert gathered the final legal folders carefully before nodding respectfully toward me and leaving us alone together. The silence between my son and me felt heavier than any argument could have. After several minutes, Ethan finally looked up with tired, emotional eyes that suddenly reminded me of Richard during the hardest years of building the company. "I really thought you needed us," he admitted quietly. I felt my throat tighten hearing those words because he still did not fully understand the truth. "I needed my family," I answered softly. "Not their permission to matter." Ethan lowered his head immediately. Outside the conference room, employees walked through the marble hallway carrying coffee and paperwork, completely unaware that an entire family had just changed forever behind those closed doors. Vanessa slowly approached the table before speaking in a voice far smaller than before. "I am sorry for how we treated you at the funeral." I studied her face carefully, and for the first time I no longer saw arrogance there. Only embarrassment and regret. I placed my hand gently over the signed will before looking back toward my son. "Your father did not leave this company to the strongest voice in the room," I said quietly. "He left it to the person who never walked away when things became difficult." Tears slowly filled Ethan's eyes while snow drifted softly against the windows behind him, because finally, after years of success, wealth, and status, he understood the lesson Richard tried to protect until his final breath. The people who stand beside you during the hardest seasons of life are the ones who matter most long after the money is gone.